The hall went silent the moment King Cale Ashrin raised his hand for quiet, and Ivy Calloway felt her heart drop before he even opened his mouth. She was sitting at the high table in her Luna gown, the one stitched with silver thread along the collar, the one she had worn to please a man who rarely looked at her twice. The coronation feast had been loud only a second ago, full of laughter and clinking cups, but now 300 pairs of eyes turned toward the throne, and Ivy's stomach turned with them. Cale stood tall in his dark ceremonial coat, his jaw set, his eyes scanning the crowd like a man about to deliver good news. He did not look at Ivy. He looked past her, toward the side door where Celine Voss stood waiting, dressed in deep red, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, as if she had rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. "Tonight," Cale said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "I have an announcement that will shape the future of this pack." Ivy's hands went still on the table. She already knew. Somehow, before the words even left his mouth, her body understood what her mind refused to accept. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples spread through the crowd in gasps and whispers and the scrape of chairs as people turned to look at the Luna, the woman who had stood beside Cale for 3 years, the woman who had healed his warriors after every battle, who had planned this very feast with her own hands. Ivy felt the weight of every stare land on her at once, heavy and curious, waiting to see her break. She did not break. Something strange happened instead. A calm spread through her chest, cool and clear, like water finding its level after a storm. She had spent 3 years waiting for Cale to love her, the way she had once hoped he would. She had spent 3 years making excuses for his coldness, his long absences, the way he spoke to her like a business partner instead of a wife. She had told herself that duty could grow into affection if she was patient enough, gentle enough, useful enough. Sitting there, listening to him announce another woman's pregnancy in front of the entire pack, she finally understood that patience had only ever been a trap she built for herself. Celine's smile was small and sharp, aimed directly at Ivy, daring her to react. Ivy stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not knock over her chair, or throw her cup, or call Cale every name that rose in her throat. She simply stood, smoothed the front of her gown with both hands, the way she smoothed the edges of bandages when she worked in the healing rooms, and she smiled. It was not a bitter smile. It was not forced. It was the kind of smile that comes when a long, exhausting weight finally lifts from a person's shoulders, when a question that has haunted them for years is finally answered, even if the answer is not the one they wanted. The hall, which had expected tears, expected a scene, expected the Luna to crumble in front of her husband and his mistress, instead watched her walk calmly down the steps of the high table, past the warriors who had sworn to protect her, past the elders who had blessed her marriage, past Celine, whose smile faltered for the first time. Ivy. Cale's voice cracked slightly on her name, and it was the first time in months he had said it like it mattered. She did not stop walking. Ivy. Wait. She reached the great doors of the hall, pushed them open with both hands, and stepped out into the cold night air, without once looking back. The doors closed behind her, with a heavy sound that echoed through the sudden silence inside. Outside, the moon was full and bright over the pack grounds, casting long shadows across the training yard, where she had once watched Cale spar with his warriors, admiring the strength in his arms, and telling herself that a man who fought so hard to protect his people must have a good heart buried somewhere beneath the armor. She had believed that for 3 years. She had built an entire marriage on that belief, brick by brick, while he built something else entirely with someone else. Ivy walked past the fountain in the courtyard, past the guest houses, past the training yard, until she reached the healing house at the edge of the compound, the one building in the entire territory that had always felt like it belonged to her. She had spent countless nights here, stitching wounds, mixing remedies, sitting with sick children until their fevers broke. This was the only place in Cale's kingdom where she had ever felt like herself instead of a title. She sat down on the wooden bench outside the healing house and let herself breathe for the first time since Cale had opened his mouth. Inside the hall, chaos had broken loose the moment the doors shut behind her. "Someone go after her," Cale snapped at the guards near the entrance, his composure cracking in front of the very crowd he had just tried to impress. Now. 2 warriors moved toward the doors, but Celine's voice cut through the room, sharp and controlled. "Let her go, my king. This is a night of celebration. We should not let one person's disappointment ruin what we have built." The crowd's attention shifted between the two women. One gone, one glowing with self-satisfaction, and Cale stood frozen between them, realizing too late that his announcement had not gone the way he imagined. He had expected tears. He had expected Ivy to plead, to beg him to reconsider, to give him the chance to explain himself in front of everyone so he could look merciful when he finally allowed her to stay as a lesser wife, a formality, a name on old paperwork. He had not expected her to simply walk away with a smile. The elders exchanged uneasy glances. Among the older wolves in the pack, Aluna's calm departure carried more weight than any scream ever could. Screaming meant heartbreak. Silence meant judgment. And judgment, in their world, was something a king could not simply order away. Cale sat back down slowly, his jaw tight, and gestured for the feast to continue, though the laughter that returned to the hall was thinner now, quieter, laced with whispers that would not stop until dawn. Back at the healing house, Ivy sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the moon, and thought about the day she had first arrived at this pack, as a bride chosen more for her healing gift than for love. Her own parents, minor healers from a smaller territory, had arranged the match to secure protection and standing for their family. Ivy had been 18, hopeful despite the arrangement, believing that if she gave everything she had to her new husband and his people, something real might grow between them eventually. She thought of the early months, when Cale had at least been polite, even attentive in small ways, walking with her through the gardens, asking about her work in the healing house, listening when she spoke about the remedies she was learning to prepare. She thought of the turning point, roughly a year into the marriage, when his visits to her chambers grew shorter and less frequent, when his eyes began drifting toward other women at gatherings, when Celine Voss arrived from a neighboring territory and quickly became a fixture at his side, under the excuse of trade negotiations that never seemed to end. Ivy had noticed. Of course she had noticed. She was not foolish, whatever the pack might have whispered about her behind closed doors. She had simply chosen, for a long time, to look away, telling herself that a king's duties were heavy, and that loneliness was the price of being married to someone with so much responsibility. Tonight, that excuse had finally run out. She heard footsteps approaching along the gravel path, and turned to see Grace, one of the younger healers who worked under her, hurrying toward the healing house with a worried expression. "My lady," Grace said, slightly out of breath. "Everyone inside is talking about what happened. Are you all right?" Ivy looked at the girl, barely 20, eyes wide with concern, and felt a strange surge of protectiveness rise in her chest. Grace had come to the healing house 3 years ago, as an orphan, with a talent for herbs, and no family to claim her. Ivy had trained her herself, had watched her grow from a frightened girl into a capable healer. And in this quiet moment, she realized Grace was one of the few genuine connections she had built in this entire kingdom that had nothing to do with her marriage. "I am better than I have been, in a long time," Ivy said honestly, and she meant it. Grace sat down beside her on the bench, glancing nervously toward the main hall in the distance. "They are saying you smiled. Is that true?" "It is true." "Why?" Ivy considered the question carefully before answering. "Because for 3 years, I have been waiting for something that was never going to happen. Tonight, he finally told me the truth, even if he did not mean to. I am not sad that the waiting is over. I am relieved." Grace studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as if she understood more than her young age should allow. "What will you do now?" It was a fair question, and one Ivy had not fully answered for herself yet, but as she sat beneath the full moon, with the sounds of the feast still faintly audible behind her, an idea began to take shape, quiet and steady, the way ideas do when a person finally stops pretending and starts thinking clearly. "I am going to leave," Ivy said. "Not tonight, not in anger, not running from anything. I am going to leave, because I finally understand that I have spent 3 years shrinking myself to fit into a life that was never meant to include me as anything more than a convenient arrangement. I do not intend to spend a 4th year doing the same thing." Grace's eyes widened. "Leave the pack? Leave the kingdom entirely?" "Yes." "Where will you go?" Ivy looked up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. thinking of the healing houses in other territories she had read about in old texts, the ones known for training healers to a level far beyond what she had learned here, the ones where a woman's skill mattered more than her marriage. Somewhere I can be useful for my own reasons. Somewhere I am not defined by who I am married to. The two of them sat together in silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of music and laughter that no longer felt like they belonged to Ivy at all. Inside the healing house, Ivy began quietly gathering what belonged to her. Her herbal texts, carefully copied and annotated over years of study. Her mother's old healing kit, worn leather and brass clasps, one of the only things she had brought with her from her childhood home. A handful of dried herbs she had cultivated herself in the small garden behind the healing house, ones that did not grow easily elsewhere, and had taken her seasons to perfect. She moved through the familiar shelves with steady hands, choosing carefully, leaving behind anything that had been given to her as a symbol of her marriage rather than as something truly hers. By the time she returned to her chambers in the main house, the feast had finally quieted, most guests retreating to their rooms or their own territories for the night. She moved through the halls unnoticed, slipping into the room she had shared with Cale for 3 years, a room that had never quite felt like home despite the fine furniture and the wide window overlooking the training grounds. She packed only what belonged to her, and it did not take long. A few dresses she had chosen herself, rather than ones selected to please the pack's image of a proper Luna. Letters from her parents, tied with faded ribbon. A small collection of jewelry that had been hers before the marriage. Nothing given by Cale or his family. Everything else she left exactly where it was, including the ceremonial cuff that marked her as his wife, which she removed carefully and placed on the vanity beside a folded piece of parchment. On the parchment, she wrote only a few lines, her handwriting steady despite everything. You never needed a wife. You needed someone to stand beside you at ceremonies and heal your warriors without complaint. I gave you both for 3 years, and I do not regret the good I did for this pack. But I am done pretending that duty is the same thing as love. Congratulations on your heir. I hope Celine gives you the family you clearly wanted all along. I wish you nothing but the truth from now on, since you seem to need practice hearing it. She set the parchment beside the cuff and looked around the room one last time, not with sadness, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone closing a chapter they had outgrown. By the time the first light of dawn touched the edges of the sky, Ivy Calloway was already beyond the borders of the territory she had called home for 3 years, a small bag over her shoulder, her mother's healing kit against her hip, and no destination fixed in her mind except forward. Behind her, the kingdom she left would wake to find its Luna gone, and the king who had announced his triumph the night before would soon discover that some victories come with a price far heavier than he had ever imagined. She did not look back at the gates as she walked away. She had already spent 3 years looking backward, waiting for a love that never arrived. For the first time since she was 18 years old, Ivy Calloway walked forward, into a life that belonged entirely to her, and the smile that had confused an entire hall of wolves the night before returned to her face, quiet and real, as the sun rose over the road ahead. Back inside the pack house, morning arrived with a strange heaviness that no one could quite explain. Servants moved through the halls quietly, avoiding eye contact, whispering only when they thought no one important could hear. The story of the Luna's calm departure had already spread through every corner of the compound before the sun had fully cleared the trees, passed from guard to guard, from kitchen to healing house, growing a little more dramatic with every telling, though the core of it never changed. She had smiled. She had walked away without a single tear. Cale woke late, his head heavy from the wine of the previous night, and reached instinctively toward the other side of the bed, before remembering that Ivy had not shared it in months. Still, something about the silence of the room felt different this morning, sharper somehow, and it took him a moment to understand why. He rose and crossed to the vanity, where the folded parchment and the ceremonial cuff waited exactly where Ivy had left them. He read her words twice, then a third time, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something he did not have a name for yet. Something that sat heavy and unfamiliar in his chest. He called for his personal guard, a steady older wolf named Edward who had served the Ashran family for 2 decades and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. "Where is she?" Cale asked, his voice tighter than he intended. Edward hesitated before answering. "The Luna left before dawn, my king. Alone. No one stopped her, as no formal order was given. Why did no one wake me? You gave no instruction last night, beyond letting the feast continue. We assumed she would return by morning, as she always has before. Cale said nothing for a long moment, staring at the parchment in his hand, and Edward, sensing the tension in the room, excused himself quietly, leaving the king alone, with a silence that felt far louder than any argument could have been. Downstairs, in the great hall, Celine Voss moved through the morning light with the easy confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. She greeted the elders warmly, accepted their careful congratulations on her condition, and settled into a chair near the head of the table, as though she had always belonged there. But even she noticed the strange quiet that had settled over the pack, the way conversations dropped when she entered a room, the way the elders' eyes lingered on her a moment too long before looking away. An older woman named Nora, one of the pack's most respected elders and a longtime friend of Ivy's late mentor, approached Celine with a polite but measured expression. "You must be very pleased with how last night went," Nora said carefully. "I am," Celine replied, one hand resting on her stomach. The king finally acknowledged what has been true for months. Nora's eyes did not warm the way Celine expected. A king's acknowledgement means little if his pack does not follow with the same enthusiasm. You may want to remember that a Luna is not chosen only by the king's heart. She is chosen by the loyalty of the people around her as well. Celine's smile faltered slightly at the comment, though she recovered quickly, brushing it off as the bitterness of an old woman set in her ways. She did not yet understand that Nora's words were not bitterness at all, but a warning, one that would prove far more accurate than Celine could have imagined in the days that followed. By midday, Cale had summoned his closest advisors to discuss what he framed as a temporary absence, though the tightness in his jaw suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. Among them was a younger beta named Daniel, sharp-eyed and unafraid to speak plainly, who had always respected Ivy for the tireless work she did in the healing house, often working through the night to save warriors that lesser healers had given up on. "With respect, my king," Daniel said, once the others had finished offering vague reassurances. "The Luna did not leave because she was overwhelmed or emotional. She left because she made a decision. Women like her do not make decisions like that lightly, and they rarely reverse them once made." Cale's eyes narrowed. "You speak as though you know her better than I do." "I know her as someone who has watched her work herself past exhaustion for this pack for 3 years without complaint," Daniel said evenly. "I simply believe that a woman who endures that much silently does not walk away from a full hall of witnesses without having already made peace with never coming back." The words settled uncomfortably in the room, and though Cale dismissed the meeting shortly after, with orders to send trackers along the southern roads, the unease Daniel's observation had planted did not leave him. He told himself it was concern for pack stability, for appearances, for the practical matter of needing a properly recognized Luna at his side. He did not yet allow himself to consider that the hollow feeling spreading through his chest might be something closer to loss. Outside the pack house, the road stretched long and quiet ahead of Ivy, the morning sun warm on her shoulders, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she walked without the weight of expectation pressing down on her back. Whatever waited for her beyond the borders of Cale Ashrin's kingdom, she intended to meet it as herself, fully and without apology, and that thought alone carried her farther than any destination could. 3 days of walking brought Ivy Calloway to the edge of a territory she had only read about in old healing texts, a stretch of land ruled by the Hartley pack, known less for its warriors and more for the quality of its healers, who trained for years, under strict masters, before earning the right to treat anyone beyond their own household. She had chosen this direction on purpose, remembering a passage from one of her mother's old books describing the Hartley Healing House as one of the finest in the region, a place where skill mattered more than bloodline or marriage. The border crossing was simple enough. A young guard named Oliver stopped her at the checkpoint, eyeing her travel-worn cloak and the leather healing kit strapped to her hip. "State your business," he said, though his tone was more curious than suspicious. "I am a healer looking for work," Ivy answered honestly. "I have training in herbal remedies, wound care, and fever treatment. I was hoping to find a place in your healing house, even if only as an assistant." Oliver studied her for a long moment, then glanced at the healing kit again. "That is an old style of case. My grandmother had one just like it. Where did you train? Under my mother, and later, under the healers of my former pack. Which pack was that? Ivy hesitated only briefly before answering. She had already decided, somewhere along the road, that she would not hide her past out of shame, only out of practicality. There was no need to announce herself as the former Luna of the Ashran Kingdom to every stranger she met, but she also had no intention of lying outright. A smaller territory to the east. It did not work out the way I hoped, so I am starting fresh here, if the Hartley pack will have me. Something in her honest, tired answer seemed to satisfy Oliver, and he waved her through with instructions to seek out the healing house near the center of the settlement, run by a woman named Claire who oversaw all training and placement of healers within the territory. The Hartley settlement was smaller than the kingdom Ivy had left behind, but it buzzed with a different kind of energy, practical and industrious, filled with the sounds of trade carts and children playing near the market square, rather than the rigid formality she had grown used to at court. She found the healing house easily enough, a long stone building with herbs drying along every window ledge, and stepped inside to the smell of crushed mint and boiling water. Claire turned out to be a stern-faced woman in her 50s, gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, her hands stained faintly yellow from years of working with turmeric and other staining herbs. She looked Ivy over with the same sharp assessment Oliver had given her, though with far less patience. "Another wanderer looking for easy work, I suppose," Claire said, not unkindly, but bluntly. "We get a few every season. Most cannot tell the difference between chamomile and yarrow. I can prepare a fever tonic in under 10 minutes with what most healing houses keep in stock," Ivy replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "I can set a broken bone without assistance, and I have treated wounds that most healers would refuse to touch, out of fear of infection spreading to themselves." Claire's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time her expression shifted from dismissive to genuinely curious. "Bold claims. Prove them." Ivy spent the rest of that afternoon demonstrating exactly what she knew, working alongside 2 other healers on patients who had come in with everything from a stubborn cough to a poorly healed fracture from weeks earlier. She moved through each case, with steady, practiced hands, explaining her reasoning as she worked, not to show off, but because she had always believed that teaching was as important as healing itself. By the time evening fell, Claire had seen enough. "You will start tomorrow," Claire said simply, handing her a key to one of the small rooms above the healing house reserved for staff. "We do not pay much, but you will not go hungry, and you will learn things here you did not know you did not know." That night, in a narrow bed in an unfamiliar room, Ivy slept more soundly than she had in years, free from the weight of a title that had never quite fit her, and the constant, quiet ache of hoping for a love that had never been given fairly in return. The following weeks settled into a rhythm that felt, to Ivy's surprise, more like peace than she had expected loneliness to feel. She rose early each morning to help prepare remedies before the healing house opened, spent long hours treating patients alongside Claire and the other healers, and in the evenings, studied late into the night from the extensive collection of texts the Hartley Healing House had built up over generations. She learned new techniques she had never encountered in Kale's territory, methods for treating deep wounds without infection, ways of easing fevers in young children that reduced the risk of lasting damage, and slowly, patient by patient, she began to feel like herself again, not a Luna, not a wife waiting for affection that never came, simply a healer, doing work that mattered. Word of her skill spread quickly through the settlement, as word tends to do in close communities. Within a month, patients began specifically requesting her by name. First the locals, who had grown to trust her steady hands, then travelers passing through, who had heard whispers of a new healer at the Hartley house, with an unusually deep knowledge of herbal remedies. Claire noticed the shift too, though she said little about it directly, preferring instead to simply give Ivy more responsibility as the weeks passed, trusting her with more complicated cases, eventually allowing her to train the younger healers alongside her. "You did not learn all of this from a small Eastern pack," Claire said one evening, as the two of them cleaned instruments after a long day. It was not quite a question, but it left room for Ivy to answer if she chose. Ivy considered how much to share. She had grown to trust Claire in the weeks they had worked together, and something about the older woman's blunt honesty made her feel that half-truths would not serve either of them well. I trained under some of the finest healers in a much larger kingdom, she said carefully. My marriage there did not end the way I hoped, so I left, and I do not particularly wish to discuss the details. Claire nodded slowly, accepting the boundary without pushing further. Whatever happened, their loss is our gain. I have not seen instincts like yours in a healer this young in a very long time. The praise settled warmly in Ivy's chest, a stark contrast to the years of quiet criticism she had absorbed in Cale's court, where her healing work had often been treated as a pleasant hobby, rather than a genuine skill worthy of respect. Here, in this smaller, less glamorous territory, she was finally being seen for what she actually offered the world, rather than for the title she carried, or the marriage she had entered. It was during her second month at the Hartley Healing House that she first crossed paths with Rowan Ellison, a beta from a neighboring territory, who arrived at the healing house late one evening with a deep cut along his forearm, the result of a training accident during a joint exercise between allied packs. He was calm despite the wound, his expression more apologetic than pained, as though he felt guilty for interrupting the healing house so late in the evening. I am sorry to bother you at this hour, he said, as Ivy guided him to a treatment table and began examining the cut. I told my training partner it was nothing, but he insisted I come regardless. Your training partner was right to insist, Ivy replied, cleaning the wound carefully. This is deep enough that it needs proper stitching, not just a bandage and good intentions. He winced slightly as she worked, but did not complain, watching her hands with quiet interest. You are new here. I have visited this healing house many times over the years, and I do not recognize you. I arrived about 2 months ago. From where? Ivy glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes for the first time, and found something steady and unassuming there, none of the calculated charm she had grown used to in the wolves who orbited Cale's court. Somewhere far from here. I am starting over. Rowan seemed to understand, without needing further explanation, that this was not a subject she wished to elaborate on, and rather than pressing, he simply nodded and let the conversation shift to lighter topics, asking about her impressions of the Hartley territory, sharing a few stories about his own pack and the joint training exercises that had become more frequent between the allied territories in recent months. By the time she finished stitching the wound and wrapping it securely, nearly an hour had passed, filled with easy, unhurried conversation that left Ivy feeling something she had not felt in longer than she could remember, a simple, comfortable ease in another person's presence, free of expectation or performance. Thank you, Rowan said, flexing his arm carefully to test the stitches. You have a gentle hand, even when the work itself is not gentle. That is the entire point of good healing, Ivy replied, allowing herself a small smile. Painful necessity delivered with care. He returned the smile, then hesitated at the door before leaving, as though considering whether to say something further. I hope your fresh start treats you well here. This territory could use more healers, with hands as steady as yours. After he left, Ivy sat alone in the quiet healing house for a while, replaying the simple exchange in her mind, surprised by how much lighter she felt after a single unremarkable conversation with a stranger who expected nothing from her beyond competent care for his wound. Meanwhile, far to the east, in the kingdom she had left behind, the search for Ivy Calloway had turned up nothing but frustration. Trackers sent along the southern roads returned with vague reports of a woman matching her description passing through various settlements, but no confirmed location, and Cale's mood had grown darker with each failed report, though he told himself repeatedly that his frustration was about the practical difficulties of ruling without a properly recognized Luna, and nothing more personal than that. He did not yet know that the woman he had dismissed so easily was, at that very moment, 3 territories away, building a life entirely her own, earning the respect and admiration of an entire community through nothing but her own skill and quiet determination, and that the distance between them was growing not just in miles, but in something far harder to close. Celine, for her part, spent those early weeks settling comfortably into the role Ivy had vacated, though comfort did not always translate into competence. She redecorated the Luna's chambers within days of Ivy's departure, replacing the simple, practical furnishings Ivy had favored, with heavier, more ornate pieces, shipped in from her family's territory. She began attending council meetings she had no real understanding of, offering opinions on trade agreements and border disputes, that made the older advisors exchange uneasy glances behind her back. Nora, the elder who had warned Celine so carefully after the coronation feast, watched these changes with growing concern, though she kept her observations mostly to herself, sharing them only with a small circle of trusted friends among the pack's senior members. "She mistakes the title for the role," Nora said one afternoon to Edward, the king's longtime guard, as they walked together through the training grounds. Ivy never assumed authority she had not earned. She listened before she spoke. She healed before she demanded recognition for healing. Celine demands recognition before she has done anything to earn it. Edward nodded grimly, his loyalty to the Ashrin family evident in the careful way he chose his words even in private conversation. The king seems distracted these days. He attends the meetings, but his mind is elsewhere. "Grief does that to a man," Nora said. "Even grief he refuses to name as grief." Edward glanced at her sharply. "You believe he misses her?" "I believe," Nora said carefully, "that a man does not send trackers along 3 different roads for a wife he claims he never truly wanted." The observation hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood, and neither of them said anything further on the matter, though the thought lingered in both their minds as they continued their walk in silence. Back in the Hartley territory, Ivy's days continued their steady, productive rhythm, each one a little easier than the last as she grew more comfortable in her new surroundings. Rowan returned to the healing house periodically over the following weeks, sometimes for legitimate reasons related to training injuries among his warriors, and other times, Ivy began to suspect, simply to check in on her progress and share a bit of conversation during her rare quiet moments between patients. She found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit, not out of any romantic interest yet, but simply because he treated her like a person rather than a role. He asked about her opinions on healing techniques, and actually listened to her answers. He remembered small details from previous conversations, like the fact that she preferred chamomile tea to the stronger herbal blends most healers favored, or that she had mentioned once, in passing, that she missed the sound of rain on a particular type of roof from her childhood home. "You remember strange things," she told him one evening, when he arrived with a small package of chamomile from a trader who had passed through his territory, unprompted and unnecessary, but thoughtful all the same. "I remember things that matter," Rowan replied simply, setting the package on the healing house counter. "You mentioned once that the healing house here does not stock enough of it for your own use, since most patients prefer the stronger blends. I happen to have extra." It was a small gesture, barely worth mentioning to anyone else, but it settled warmly in Ivy's chest all the same. A quiet reminder that kindness did not always need grand declarations to matter. She had spent 3 years in a marriage full of grand ceremonies and public titles that had ultimately meant nothing, and here, in this much smaller, much quieter life, a simple package of chamomile tea felt more genuine than anything Cale had ever offered her. As the weeks turned into 2 full months since her arrival, Claire began entrusting Ivy with the most difficult cases the healing house received, including a young child from a neighboring farm who had fallen seriously ill with a fever that refused to break under normal treatment. Ivy worked through the night beside the child's worried parents, adjusting her approach carefully as she monitored the fever's progress, drawing on knowledge she had gathered from years of study and practical experience, treating warriors who had returned from battle with wounds gone wrong. By dawn, the fever finally broke, and the child slept peacefully for the first time in 3 days. The parents wept with relief, thanking Ivy repeatedly, and word of the successful treatment spread through the settlement within hours, cementing her reputation as one of the finest healers the Hartley territory had seen in a generation. Claire found her afterward, exhausted but quietly satisfied, cleaning her instruments in the pale morning light. "You could have a healing house of your own within the year, if you wanted one," Claire said, studying her with something like pride. "You have the skill for it, and now you have the reputation to match." Ivy considered the idea seriously for the first time, turning it over in her mind as she finished her work. A healing house of her own, built entirely through her own effort and skill, answerable to no husband, no court, no expectations beyond the quality of the care she provided. It was a future entirely different from the one she had imagined for herself as a young bride 3 years earlier, and yet it felt more true to who she actually was than anything her marriage had ever offered. "I would like that," she said finally, and meant it completely. Outside the healing house, the sun rose fully over the Hartley territory, warm and steady, illuminating a life Ivy Calloway was building entirely on her own terms. One patient, one remedy, one quiet act of kindness at a time. While far to the east, the kingdom she had left behind continued its slow, uneasy unraveling, unaware of how far she had already traveled beyond their reach, and how little she intended to look back. 3 months after Ivy's departure, the Ashran kingdom looked, on the surface, much the same as it always had. Warriors still trained in the yard each morning. Trade continued along the usual routes. The council still met twice a week to discuss border matters and resource allocation. But beneath that familiar surface, something essential had shifted. A quiet erosion that most outsiders would not notice, but that anyone who had lived within these walls for years could feel in the air itself. Cale noticed it first in small things. The warriors trained with the same discipline as before, but the easy camaraderie that had once filled the yard with laughter and friendly jeers had grown thinner, replaced by a kind of careful, guarded politeness. The kitchen staff still prepared meals on schedule, but the meals themselves had lost some indefinable quality, as though even the cooks had lost some of their enthusiasm for a kitchen no longer overseen by a Luna who had once thanked them personally for every dish, who had learned each of their names and asked after their families. He found himself, more often than he cared to admit, walking past the healing house out of habit, half expecting to see Ivy through the window, tending to a patient with the same quiet focus she always brought to her work. The healing house had continued functioning under Grace, who had stepped into a leadership role far sooner than she felt ready for, but even she admitted, when Cale visited under the thin excuse of checking on pack resources, that the healing house simply operated differently without Ivy's steady presence at its center. "She trained all of us," Grace said carefully, aware she was speaking to the king, but unwilling to hide the truth to spare his feelings. But there were things she did that cannot be taught easily. She knew things about each patient beyond their symptoms. She remembered which warriors feared needles, and which ones needed a firm hand instead of gentle words. "We are managing, my king, but we are not thriving the way we did when she was here." Cale said nothing in response, merely nodded, and left the healing house with a heaviness in his chest he refused to examine too closely. Celine, meanwhile, had begun to feel the pack's quiet withdrawal in ways that frustrated her more openly than Cale's silent unease. She had expected, upon becoming the acknowledged mother of the king's heir, that the pack would rally around her with the same warmth and respect they had shown Ivy, but instead she found herself met with polite distance at best and thinly veiled disapproval at worst. "They still speak of her as though she never left," Celine complained to Cale one evening, several weeks into her 4th month of pregnancy, her irritation evident in the sharp edge of her voice. "I hear her name in the kitchens, in the healing house, even among the warriors. It has been months, and yet this pack acts as though I am some temporary guest rather than their future Luna." "They will adjust," Cale said, though even he heard the lack of conviction in his own voice. "When?" Celine pressed. "I am carrying your heir, Cale. I have given up my own territory's standing to be here, to build a life with you, and yet I am treated like an outsider in my own home." Cale did not have a satisfying answer for her, in part because he had begun to privately wonder the same thing himself, though he was careful not to voice that particular doubt aloud. The pack's loyalty had always seemed like a given to him, something inherited alongside his crown, rather than something actively earned through years of consistent, careful effort. He was only now beginning to understand, watching the quiet distance growing between Celine and the pack she was meant to lead, that loyalty of that kind could not simply be announced into existence. It had to be built, patiently, the way Ivy had built it, one small act of genuine care at a time. The trackers Cale had sent out in the weeks following Ivy's departure returned, one by one, with nothing but frustrating dead ends. A merchant in a border town recalled a woman matching her description passing through months earlier, but had no further information about her destination. A small settlement 2 territories away reported a healer who had briefly treated patients before continuing on, though descriptions of her appearance varied enough between witnesses that the trackers could not confirm it was truly Ivy. "She has covered her tracks well," the head tracker reported to Cale during one of their increasingly tense meetings. "Or she has simply traveled far enough that our usual networks no longer reach her." "Keep searching," Cale instructed, his patience wearing thin. "My king, If I may speak plainly, the tracker said carefully, we have expended significant resources over these past months, with little result. Perhaps it would be wiser to redirect our efforts toward matters that require more immediate attention within the pack itself. Cale dismissed the suggestion with visible irritation, though a small, honest part of him recognized the wisdom in it. He was not entirely certain, if he examined his own motivations closely, whether his continued search for Ivy was truly about pack stability, as he told himself and everyone around him, or whether it had become something more personal, a stubborn refusal to accept that a woman he had dismissed so casually could simply vanish from his life without consequence. Daniel, the young beta who had spoken so plainly during the council meeting weeks earlier, found himself increasingly drawn into private conversations with Cale as the king's uncertainty grew, though Daniel remained careful never to overstep the bounds of his position. You seem troubled, my king, Daniel observed one evening, as the two of them reviewed reports from the pack's eastern border. The pack requires stability, Cale said, repeating the explanation that had become almost automatic by now. A kingdom without a properly recognized Luna invites uncertainty among our allies and our own people. With respect, my king, I do not believe that is the whole truth of what troubles you. Cale looked up sharply, but something in Daniel's steady, unafraid expression stopped him from dismissing the comment outright. Speak plainly then, since you seem determined to, regardless of my preference. I believe, Daniel said carefully, that you did not fully understand what you had until it walked out of that hall. I do not say this to cause you further distress, but because I believe you deserve honesty from at least one advisor, even if it is uncomfortable to hear. Cale was silent for a long moment, staring at the reports in front of him without truly seeing them. You believe I made a mistake. I believe, Daniel said, choosing his words with obvious care, that the Luna gave this pack everything she had for 3 years, without complaint, without demanding recognition, beyond what her work naturally earned her. I believe that kind of quiet dedication is rare, and that most people do not recognize its value until it is gone. I do not know what happened between you and Lady Celine, and it is not my place to judge that. But I do know that this pack has felt her absence in ways that go far beyond simple politics. Cale did not respond immediately, and Daniel, sensing he had said as much as the moment could bear, excused himself quietly, leaving the king alone with reports he no longer had the focus to properly review. That night, unable to sleep, Cale found himself walking the halls of the pack house, much the way Ivy once had, though for entirely different reasons. He passed the healing house, dark and quiet at this late hour, and found himself remembering small moments he had barely registered at the time. Ivy staying up through the night to treat a warrior's infected wound, refusing to rest until she was certain the man would recover. Ivy quietly correcting a young healer's mistake without embarrassing the girl in front of others. Ivy sitting with him during a difficult council session years ago, saying nothing, simply present, a steady calm beside him that he had taken entirely for granted. He had told himself, for months before the coronation feast, that his growing distance from Ivy was simply the natural evolution of a marriage built on duty rather than affection, that Celine offered him something more exciting, more passionate, more aligned with what he believed a king deserved. Standing alone in the dark hallway outside the healing house, he found himself questioning, for the first time honestly, whether that belief had been entirely true, or whether he had simply mistaken excitement for something more substantial than it actually was. Celine's pregnancy continued to progress through these months, and with it came complications that went beyond the physical. Her family, minor nobility from a neighboring territory, with ambitions larger than their actual standing, began sending increasingly frequent messages, first offering congratulations, then subtly inquiring about formal arrangements for Celine's position within the Ashran kingdom, and eventually making requests that struck even Cale's advisors as presumptuous, involving trade concessions and territorial adjustments that would benefit Celine's family far more than the Ashran pack itself. They move quickly, Edward observed to Cale after reviewing one such message. Perhaps too quickly, for a family whose daughter has not yet secured a formal marriage, only a promise made in the heat of a coronation feast. Cale frowned at the observation, uncomfortable with the implication, but unable to entirely dismiss it. He had, in the month since the feast, made no formal move to actually marry Celine, telling himself the timing was simply not right given the pack's current instability. though a small, honest part of him wondered whether his hesitation stemmed from something deeper than timing. Celine noticed the delay too, and her patience, never particularly deep to begin with, began wearing visibly thin as the weeks passed without any formal announcement of marriage, leaving her position within the pack ambiguous and increasingly uncomfortable, a status she found herself sharing, ironically, with the very predecessor she had once dismissed so easily as a woman who would simply fade quietly into irrelevance. The kingdom Cale had once ruled with confident, unquestioned authority had, within a matter of months, become a landscape of quiet uncertainty, unspoken doubts, and a growing awareness among his closest advisors that the king's judgment, so trusted for years, had perhaps faltered in ways that would take considerably longer than a single season to fully repair. At the edge of the training yard, two young warriors named Henry and Lucas leaned against the fence during a rare break, watching the newer recruits struggle through a drill neither of them remembered finding quite so difficult in their own early days. "Have you noticed the difference?" Lucas asked quietly, glancing toward the main house where Cale's silhouette occasionally passed by an upper window. "Everyone has noticed," Henry replied. "My mother says the pack has a mood to it, the way weather has a feeling, before a storm arrives. She says packs are like that, sensitive to whoever stands at their center. Do you think the king regrets it?" Henry considered the question carefully before answering. "I think he is beginning to. Whether he admits it to himself is a different matter entirely." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of the trackers Cale had sent out weeks earlier, returning through the main gate looking travel-worn and clearly bearing no good news, based on the slump of his shoulders and the way he avoided meeting anyone's eyes as he made his way toward the main house to deliver his report. Word of the tracker's return spread quickly, as such things always did, and by evening the general understanding among the pack was that the search for their former Luna had once again come up empty, further deepening the strange, unspoken tension that had settled over the kingdom in the months since her departure. Nora, watching these developments unfold with the patient, careful attention of someone who had seen many kings rise and fall over her long life, found herself increasingly convinced that the Ashran kingdom stood at a turning point, though which direction it would ultimately turn remained, for now, entirely uncertain. "A kingdom can survive many things," she remarked to Edward one evening, as they observed the pack's subdued mood from the quiet vantage point of the garden. "Poor harvests, difficult winters, even conflict with neighboring territories. But it struggles far more when the trust between its people and its leader begins to erode, because trust, once broken, rebuilds far slower than any physical damage ever could." Edward said nothing in response, merely nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the darkened window of the king's study, where Cale remained long after the rest of the packhouse had gone quiet for the night, wrestling with questions he had never expected to need answers to, and finding none that satisfied him. By the time the cold season arrived in the Hartley territory, nearly 5 months after Ivy had first walked through its gates, she had become such a fixture in the daily life of the settlement that few residents could remember what the healing house had been like before her arrival. Claire had begun speaking openly of retirement within the next few years, a subject she had never raised before Ivy joined the staff, and the reason for the shift was not hard to understand. "You have earned the trust of this entire settlement faster than any healer I have trained in 30 years, Claire told her one crisp morning, as frost clung to the edges of the windows and the healing house filled with the warm smell of ginger tea brewing for patients battling the season's first colds. "I have been thinking about what comes next, for both of us." Ivy looked up from the herbs she was sorting, curious. "What do you mean?" "There is an old healing outpost at the northern edge of the territory, near the farming communities, that currently have to travel half a day to reach proper care," Claire explained. "It has sat empty for years, ever since the healer who ran it passed on, and no one stepped forward to take her place. The Territory Council has discussed reopening it several times, but never found the right person to lead it." Ivy set down the herbs slowly, understanding the direction of the conversation before Claire finished it. "You are suggesting I take it on?" "I am suggesting," Claire said, "that you have outgrown being an assistant here, however skilled an assistant you have been. You have the knowledge, the discipline, and now the reputation to run a healing house of your own. The Northern Outpost would give you exactly that opportunity, and it would serve communities that badly need proper care." The idea settled over Ivy with a mixture of excitement and quiet disbelief. 5 months earlier, she had walked away from a kingdom, a title, and a marriage, with nothing but a small bag and her mother's healing kit, uncertain of what waited for her beyond the road ahead. Now she was being offered the chance to build and lead something entirely her own, answerable to no husband, no court, no expectations beyond the quality of care she provided to the people who needed her. "I would need to see it first," she said carefully, though her voice already carried the note of someone who had largely made up her mind. "Of course," Claire said, smiling for perhaps the first time since Ivy had known her. "I suspected you would say yes eventually. I simply wanted to plant the idea before someone else did." The northern outpost, when Ivy finally traveled there 2 weeks later, accompanied by Claire and a small group of farmers eager to see the healing house reopened, turned out to be a modest stone building set at the edge of a quiet farming community, surrounded by fields that stretched toward distant hills. The building itself needed considerable repair, its roof damaged in places, its interior thick with dust from years of disuse. But Ivy found herself walking through the empty rooms with a growing sense of possibility rather than discouragement. "It needs work," she admitted to Claire, running her hand along a dust-covered counter that had once served as a preparation space for remedies. "Everything worth building needs work," Claire replied simply. The farmers who had accompanied them watched with obvious hope as Ivy examined the building, and one of them, an older man named Edward who had lived in the community his entire life, stepped forward hesitantly. "My granddaughter has struggled with fevers every winter since she was small," he said. "We have had to travel to the main settlement every time, and twice we nearly lost her because the journey took too long. If you were willing to take on this outpost, it would mean everything to families like mine." The simple, earnest plea settled something firmly in Ivy's mind, erasing whatever hesitation remained. "I will need help repairing the building before I can properly open it," she said. "But yes, I will take it on." The community's response to her decision was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, farmers who had barely known each other before began organizing work parties to repair the roof, clean the interior, and gather supplies for the healing house's reopening. Ivy found herself working alongside them through the following weeks, her hands blistered from unfamiliar labor, but her spirit lighter than it had been in years, watching an entire community come together around a shared purpose she had set in motion simply by saying yes. Rowan visited twice during those weeks of preparation, once bringing a wagon load of supplies his own territory could spare, and once simply to help with the physical labor of repairing the roof, working alongside the farmers with the same easy, unassuming manner that had drawn Ivy's attention from their very first meeting. "You did not need to come all this way to carry lumber," she told him during a break, as they sat together on an overturned crate, sharing a simple meal of bread and cheese one of the farmers' wives had prepared for the work crew. "I wanted to see it," Rowan said simply. "The healing house you are building. I have watched you work these past months, and I find myself curious about what you create when given the chance to build something entirely from the ground up, according to your own vision, rather than someone else's expectations." Ivy studied him for a moment, appreciating, not for the first time, how different his presence felt compared to the careful, calculated attention she had grown used to in Cale's court. Rowan asked nothing of her beyond honest conversation. He offered help without expecting recognition for it. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and decisions, not because they reflected on his own standing, but simply because he found her interesting as a person. "What do you think so far?" she asked, gesturing toward the half-repaired building behind them. "I think," Rowan said carefully, "that it looks exactly like something you would build. Practical, sturdy, built to last rather than to impress. I think the people here are fortunate to have found you." The compliment, simple and sincere, warmed her more than any grand declaration Cale had ever offered during their entire marriage, and she found herself smiling at Rowan with an ease that had become increasingly natural over the months of their growing friendship. The healing house officially reopened 3 weeks later, on a cold but clear morning, with nearly the entire farming community gathered to celebrate its return after years of absence. Ivy stood at the entrance, the small building behind her fully repaired and stocked with carefully organized herbs and supplies, watching as families who had struggled for years without proper care nearby finally had access to exactly that. The old farmer, Edward, brought his granddaughter to the opening ceremony, a small girl of perhaps 7 years, with a shy smile and curious eyes, and introduced her proudly to Ivy as the first official patient of the reopened healing house. though the girl was, thankfully, in perfect health that day. I wanted her to meet the woman who will keep her safe from now on, Edward said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. Ivy knelt down to the girl's level, offering a warm smile. I promise to take very good care of you and your family, whenever you need it. The girl smiled shyly in return, and the small moment, simple as it was, settled deep into Ivy's chest, as confirmation of exactly why she had made the choices she had, why walking away from a kingdom that had never truly valued her had been the right decision, despite the uncertainty it had required her to face. As the celebration continued through the morning, Ivy found a quiet moment to step away from the crowd, standing at the edge of the field behind the healing house, looking out over the distant hills that marked the horizon of her new life. 5 months earlier, she had been a Luna dismissed, in front of an entire court, humiliated by a husband who valued her only for the convenience she provided. Now she stood as the founder and leader of a healing house that an entire farming community depended on, respected not for a title given to her through marriage, but for skills and dedication she had built entirely on her own. Rowan found her there a few minutes later, joining her quietly at the edge of the field without interrupting her thoughts. "You built something remarkable here," he said softly. "I had help," Ivy replied, gesturing back toward the celebration behind them. "This community did as much as I did." "They did," Rowan agreed, "but it took someone with your particular combination of skill and determination to bring them together around a shared purpose in the first place. That is not something everyone can do, regardless of how much help they receive." Ivy turned to look at him, appreciating once again the quiet sincerity that seemed to define everything he said and did. "Thank you for coming today. It means more than you probably realize." "I would not have missed it," Rowan said simply, and something in the steady warmth of his expression told her he meant it completely. As the sun began to set over the northern outpost that evening, casting long golden light across the fields and the newly repaired healing house, Ivy allowed herself a rare moment of full, uncomplicated happiness, free from the shadows of a past she had finally, truly begun to leave behind. Over the following weeks, the northern outpost settled into a steady rhythm of its own, distinct from the busier pace of the main Hartley healing house, but no less demanding. Ivy treated everything from minor farming injuries to serious illnesses among the youngest and oldest members of the community, often working alone for long stretches before Claire sent additional support in the form of a young apprentice named Hannah, eager to learn under Ivy's guidance, the way Ivy herself had once learned under her own mother. Hannah proved to be a quick study, absorbing techniques and knowledge with an enthusiasm that reminded Ivy pleasantly of Grace, the young healer she had left behind in Kale's kingdom. She found herself, in quiet moments between patients, thinking of Grace occasionally, wondering how she was managing the healing house without her guidance, hoping the girl had continued to grow into her own skills, despite the upheaval Ivy's departure must have caused. She did not allow herself to dwell on these thoughts for long, however, aware that looking backward too often risked pulling her attention away from the life she was actively building in front of her. Still, the occasional pang of concern for the people she had left behind, people who had done nothing wrong beyond being caught within the orbit of a kingdom she no longer wished to be part of, reminded her that leaving had not been without genuine cost, even if it had ultimately been the right choice. Rowan's visits continued at a steady, unhurried pace throughout these weeks, never frequent enough to feel presumptuous, but consistent enough that Ivy found herself genuinely looking forward to them. He brought news from the wider region during each visit, updates on trade agreements between allied territories, occasional mentions of political developments that rarely concerned her directly, and slowly, without either of them explicitly naming it, their friendship deepened into something that carried the quiet warmth of genuine affection, though neither rushed to define it as more than that just yet. "You never speak much about your own family," Ivy observed one evening, as they shared a simple meal at the small table inside the healing house, after a particularly long day of treating patients. Rowan considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "My parents passed some years ago, within a season of each other. I have an older sister who leads a smaller territory to the west, and we correspond occasionally, though we are not particularly close. Beyond that, my life has largely been my own to shape, which I suppose is not so different from what you are doing here. Do you find that lonely?" Ivy asked, genuinely curious. "Sometimes," he admitted honestly. though less so recently. The simple admission carried an unspoken weight that Ivy understood clearly, and she found herself smiling softly in response, aware that whatever was growing between them deserved patience rather than rushing, given how recently her own life had been upended by a marriage that had taught her painful lessons about mistaking convenience for genuine connection. By the time winter fully settled over the northern outpost, blanketing the surrounding fields in snow, and slowing the pace of daily life throughout the farming community, Ivy had built something she had never quite managed to build during her 3 years as Luna of the Ashran Kingdom. A life that felt entirely, unmistakably her own, built on genuine relationships, real accomplishment, and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered to the people around her. Winter arrived hard in the Ashran Kingdom that year, and with it came a series of small crises that, taken individually, might have seemed unremarkable, but taken together, painted a troubling picture of a pack slowly losing its footing. A shipment of grain arrived late from a neighboring territory due to a trade dispute that Kale's advisors had failed to resolve in time, leaving the kitchens stretched thin during the coldest weeks of the season. 2 experienced warriors requested transfer to allied packs, citing personal reasons that everyone privately understood had more to do with the pack's uncertain leadership than any genuine desire to relocate. Celine, now well into her 6th month of pregnancy, had grown increasingly demanding as the weeks passed without any formal announcement of marriage from Kale, her patience worn thin by a position that remained frustratingly undefined, despite the very public declaration that had started it all. She began pressing him more directly during their private conversations, no longer content to wait quietly for him to address the matter on his own timeline. "Every day that passes without a formal marriage makes my position weaker," she told him one evening, her hand resting on the visible swell of her stomach. "The council whispers about it. Your advisors avoid the subject entirely when I raise it. I did not leave my own territories standing behind to spend the rest of my pregnancy as an unofficial guest in your home. There are matters that require careful timing," Kale replied, though the excuse sounded hollow even to his own ears after so many months of repeating it. "What matters exactly?" Celine pressed. "The pack's mood? Their lingering attachment to a woman who abandoned her position the moment things became difficult? I am the one who stayed, Kale. I am the one carrying your heir. And yet I am treated as though I am the one who should apologize for existing in this kingdom." Kale found himself with no satisfying response, aware that Celine's frustration, however sharp, was not entirely unreasonable, given the ambiguous position he had left her in for months. And yet something continued to hold him back from formalizing their arrangement, a hesitation he could not fully explain even to himself, though it had grown considerably since Ivy's departure rather than lessening with time, which struck him as increasingly strange the more he thought about it. Celine's family, growing impatient with the delay, escalated their involvement considerably during this period. Her father, a minor lord from a territory known more for its ambition than its actual resources, began sending messages directly to the Ashran Council, rather than routing his concerns through Celine or Kale alone, a breach of protocol that several advisors noted with visible discomfort. "He requests a formal meeting to discuss terms of the marriage arrangement," Edward reported to Kale during one of their private sessions, holding a sealed letter that had arrived that morning. "He also requests, separately, discussion of trade concessions along the eastern border that would primarily benefit his own territory." Kale read the letter with growing irritation, recognizing in its carefully worded demands an attempt to secure benefits for Celine's family that went well beyond what the situation actually warranted. "He moves as though the marriage is already settled. Perhaps he believes it should be, given the public nature of your announcement," Edward said carefully, "though I would note, my king, that a public announcement made in a moment of heightened emotion does not carry the same binding weight as a formal marriage contract properly negotiated and witnessed." The observation struck Kale more sharply than Edward likely intended, forcing him to confront a question he had been avoiding for months. He had announced Celine's pregnancy publicly, in a moment he now recognized had been driven as much by a desire to assert control and finality as by genuine commitment to her. He had not, in the months since, taken any of the concrete steps that would formalize their union, and the longer that gap stretched, the more it revealed about his own uncertainty regarding the choice he had made. Rumors, meanwhile, had begun circulating through the pack with increasing frequency, whispered in the kitchens and training yards where such things always traveled fastest. Some questioned whether Celine's family's aggressive maneuvering suggested less confidence in the child's parentage than their public claims implied. Others simply noted, with the particular bluntness common among warriors who had little patience for court politics, that a Luna who had earned genuine loyalty did not need a formal title to command respect, while a mistress, who had been granted status through announcement alone, seemed unable to earn that same respect, no matter how firmly Cale insisted upon her position. Nora, who had watched pack dynamics shift and settle across several generations of Ashran leadership, found herself increasingly convinced that the situation would come to a head one way or another before Celine's child was born, though she could not yet predict exactly how. A pack forgives many mistakes from its leaders, she observed, to a small gathering of fellow elders during one of their regular meetings, held in a quiet corner of the pack house, away from younger, less discreet ears. But it does not easily forgive the sense that its leader has lost his judgment entirely, and that is precisely what many here have begun to feel, whether they say it aloud or not. One of the other elders, an older woman named Sophie, who had served as an advisor to Cale's father before his death, nodded slowly in agreement. The king's father would never have allowed a matter like this to remain unresolved for so many months. He understood that ambiguity in leadership breeds far more damage than a difficult decision made clearly and quickly, even an unpopular one. "Do you believe he regrets his choice?" Sophie asked. Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe he has begun to understand what he lost, though understanding and acting on that understanding are two very different matters. Whether he finds the courage to act before this situation fully unravels remains to be seen." The council meeting called to address Celine's father's demands proved as tense as everyone had anticipated. Celine's father, a sharp-featured man named Vincent, with an ambitious gleam that Cale found increasingly distasteful the longer the meeting continued, pressed forcefully for both the formal marriage arrangement and the trade concessions he had outlined in his earlier correspondence, framing both as simple matters of honor that any reasonable king would agree to without hesitation. "My daughter has given up considerable standing in her own territory to be here," Vincent said, his tone carrying the particular confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through persistence rather than genuine merit. "The least this pack owes her is a swift, formal resolution to her position, along with reasonable compensation for the sacrifices her family has made on behalf of this arrangement." Several of Cale's advisors exchanged uneasy glances at the word compensation, recognizing in it an admission that the entire situation had, from the beginning, carried undertones of calculated advantage rather than genuine affection, a suspicion many had quietly harbored for months, but rarely voiced aloud. "I will need time to consider the full scope of these requests," Cale said, aware even as he spoke that further delay would only deepen Vincent's frustration and Celine's already fraying patience. "With respect, my king," Vincent pressed, "time is precisely what my daughter no longer has in abundance. She is carrying your heir. The child will arrive within a matter of months, and it would reflect poorly on this entire kingdom if that child were born without a formally recognized marriage in place." The pointed comment landed exactly as intended, forcing Cale into a corner he had avoided for months, through careful evasion and repeated delay. He agreed, finally, to a formal marriage date set for 6 weeks later, a decision that satisfied Vincent's immediate demands but did nothing to resolve the deeper unease that had settled over the pack in the months since Ivy's departure, an unease that Cale himself, if he was fully honest with the small, quiet part of his conscience he rarely allowed to speak, understood far better than he cared to admit to anyone around him. That night, alone in his study, long after the council meeting had ended and the pack house had gone quiet, Cale found himself staring at the same folded parchment Ivy had left behind months earlier, which he had kept hidden in a drawer, rather than discarding, as he had told himself he intended to do. He read her words again, slowly, and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what he had actually thrown away in pursuit of something that had turned out to offer him considerably less than what he had given up to obtain it. The following morning, Daniel found Cale still in his study, the same parchment now folded neatly on the desk in front of him, and though the young beta said nothing about it directly, something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what he was looking at. "You called for me, my king," Daniel said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "I have agreed to a formal marriage date with Celine," Cale said, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction, such an announcement should have brought. 6 weeks from now. Daniel absorbed this news carefully, choosing his response with the same measured caution he had shown throughout the difficult months since Ivy's departure. May I ask what changed your mind, after so many months of delay? Her father grows impatient. The child will arrive soon. I could not reasonably delay any further without inviting further scandal. Those are practical reasons, Daniel observed. I do not hear you say it is what you actually want. Cale's jaw tightened at the observation, but he did not deny it outright, which told Daniel everything he needed to know regardless of what words the king chose to offer in response. What I want has proven itself an unreliable guide these past months, Daniel. I trusted my own judgment completely once, and I have watched that judgment cost this pack more than I anticipated. Perhaps it is time I simply do what practicality demands, rather than what some uncertain feeling suggests instead. I have watched you struggle with this decision for months. I do not believe forcing yourself into a marriage, out of obligation, rather than genuine commitment, will resolve the deeper uncertainty you have carried since the coronation feast. If anything, I suspect it will only deepen it. Cale said nothing for a long moment, staring at the parchment on his desk. Ivy's steady, honest handwriting a stark contrast to the calculated maneuvering he had spent the previous evening navigating with Celine's father. What would you have me do instead, Daniel? Break my public word a second time? Humiliate Celine as thoroughly as I humiliated Ivy, simply because I have belatedly realized my own mistakes? I would have you be honest, Daniel said simply. With Celine, with this pack, and most importantly with yourself, about what you actually want your future to look like, rather than continuing to make decisions based on obligation, pride, or fear of further scandal. Whatever path you choose from here, my king, I believe it will serve you and this pack far better if it comes from genuine conviction rather than another attempt to manage appearances. The conversation left Cale with more questions than answers, and in the weeks that followed, as preparations for the formal marriage slowly began, despite his continued private uncertainty, he found himself increasingly haunted by the growing awareness that he had built his recent choices on a foundation of pride and public image, rather than anything resembling the genuine partnership he had once, however imperfectly, shared with the wife, who had walked away from him with nothing but a quiet smile and a folded piece of parchment left behind on her vanity. Spring arrived early in the Hartley territory that year, melting the snow that had blanketed the northern outpost through the coldest months, and bringing with it a renewed sense of energy throughout the farming community Ivy had come to think of as home. The healing house she had built now operated smoothly under her steady guidance, with Hannah growing more capable by the week, and the surrounding families no longer needing to travel half a day for care that had once cost lives, simply through the delay of distance. Word of Ivy's work had, by this point, spread well beyond the borders of the Hartley territory itself, carried along trade routes by merchants and travelers who spoke of a healer in the north, with an unusual depth of knowledge and an even more unusual willingness to treat anyone who needed help, regardless of their ability to pay. Healers from neighboring territories occasionally sent messages requesting guidance on difficult cases, and twice that spring, Ivy traveled briefly to nearby settlements to consult on illnesses that had stumped local healers, returning each time with her reputation further cemented as one of the most capable practitioners in the entire region. Rowan's visits had, over the preceding months, evolved from occasional friendly check-ins into something both of them now openly acknowledged as courtship, though neither rushed the process, both aware that Ivy's healing from her previous marriage required patience rather than urgency. He had begun bringing small gifts, less frequently tied to practical need, and more simply to her personal enjoyment. A book of poetry he had found in a traveling merchant's collection, a set of carved wooden figures he had commissioned from a craftsman in his own territory, after mentioning offhand that she had admired similar work in the market. "You are spoiling me," Ivy told him one evening in early spring, as they sat together outside the healing house, watching the sun set over fields just beginning to show the first green shoots of the new growing season. "I am simply paying attention," Rowan replied, "which I understand is not always the same thing as spoiling, though I imagine the distinction has not always been clear to you, given your previous experience." The gentle reference to her past marriage, offered without judgment or pity, had become something Ivy appreciated deeply about Rowan's manner. He never pressed her to share more than she wished about the years she had spent as Luna of the Ashran Kingdom, But he also never pretended that experience had not shaped her, treating her past as simply one part of a larger story, rather than something to be either dwelt upon or entirely avoided. Cale never once asked what I wanted, she admitted quietly, surprising herself with how easily the words came after months of careful silence on the subject. Not what herbs I preferred to work with, not what kind of healing house I dreamed of building, not even what I wanted for dinner most nights. He simply assumed my preferences aligned with whatever was convenient for him, and I let him assume that, for longer than I care to admit, because I believed contradicting him would only push him further away. Rowan listened without interrupting, his attention steady and complete in a way that had become deeply familiar to her over the months of their growing friendship. And now I have built an entire healing house, according to exactly what I wanted, and it turns out, I wanted quite a lot, once I finally allowed myself to consider the question honestly. She smiled slightly, glancing toward him. You ask me what I want more often than he did in 3 years of marriage. Then I will continue asking, Rowan said simply, for as long as you are willing to keep answering. It was during this same spring that news from the Eastern Kingdoms began reaching the Hartley territory with greater regularity, carried by traders who moved between the various allied territories and occasionally shared updates on political developments that touched even communities as far removed as the northern outpost. Hannah, who had taken to chatting with visiting merchants during their supply deliveries, mentioned one such piece of news to Ivy, almost in passing one afternoon, unaware of its personal significance. There is talk of a royal marriage happening soon, over in the Ashrin territory, Hannah said, sorting through a fresh delivery of dried herbs. A king marrying the mother of his child, apparently. The merchant who told me seemed to think it was overdue, given how long the pregnancy had already progressed. Ivy's hands stilled briefly over the mortar and pestle she had been using, though she recovered quickly, aware that Hannah had no idea of the connection between this news and Ivy's own past. When is the marriage meant to take place? Within the month, I believe. Why? Does the news interest you? Only curiosity, Ivy said evenly, returning her attention to the herbs in front of her, though something complicated settled in her chest that she took a quiet moment to examine honestly, rather than dismiss outright. She had expected, when the news of Cale's eventual marriage to Celine finally reached her, that it might reopen old wounds, might send her spiraling back into the hurt and humiliation of that final night in the Great Hall. Instead, sitting in the healing house she had built with her own hands, surrounded by a life she had constructed entirely on her own terms, she found the news carried surprisingly little emotional weight. It felt, more than anything, like hearing about a stranger's life, distant and largely irrelevant to the person she had become in the months since walking away. That evening, when Rowan arrived for his usual visit, she found herself sharing the news with him openly, testing her own reaction as much as informing him. Cale is finally marrying Celine, she said, watching his expression carefully for any reaction of his own. Rowan studied her for a long moment before responding, clearly gauging her emotional state before offering his own thoughts. How does that news sit with you? Ivy considered the question honestly before answering. Strangely fine, actually. I expected it to hurt more than it does. I think I have simply moved far enough away from that life that news of it now feels like hearing about people I barely remember, rather than about a husband I once hoped would love me. That sounds like healing to me, Rowan said gently, rather than avoidance. I think you might be right, Ivy admitted, and found, as she said it, that the observation felt entirely true. She had spent 5 months building a life defined by her own choices, her own skills, and increasingly, her own genuine happiness. And somewhere along the way, without any single dramatic moment marking the transition, she had stopped waiting for Cale's approval or affection, and started simply living, fully and completely, as herself. As spring deepened into early summer, the healing house continued its steady, meaningful work, and Ivy's relationship with Rowan continued its own gentle, patient progression, both growing more certain with each passing week that whatever future lay ahead of them was one worth building together, carefully and honestly, on a foundation entirely different from the one that had failed her so completely in her first marriage. A few weeks later, the northern outpost faced its greatest test since Ivy had reopened it, when a sudden illness swept through several farming families at once, striking children and elders hardest, as such illnesses often did. Ivy worked around the clock for nearly 4 days straight, barely sleeping, moving between households with Hannah at her side, carefully diagnosing each case and adjusting treatments as the illness revealed its particular patterns. Rowan arrived on the second day of the outbreak, having heard news of the crisis through his own territory's trade contacts, and immediately offered whatever help he could provide, spending long hours helping distribute remedies and sitting with frightened families, while Ivy focused her full attention on the most severe cases. "You do not need to stay," Ivy told him during a brief moment of rest on the third night, both of them exhausted, sharing a quiet cup of tea in the healing house's small kitchen. "I know I do not need to," Rowan replied simply. "I want to." By the fourth day, the worst of the outbreak had passed, and every single patient survived, a result that the community would speak of for years afterward, as proof of exactly why Ivy's healing house had become so essential to their lives. Old Edward, whose granddaughter had been among those struck by the illness, found Ivy afterward, his eyes damp with relief and gratitude he struggled to fully put into words. "You saved her," he said simply. "You saved all of them." "We saved them together," Ivy replied, glancing toward Hannah, who had worked tirelessly alongside her, and toward Rowan, who had supported the entire effort without hesitation or complaint. "This community built something strong enough to survive a crisis like this. I am simply grateful to be part of it." That night, after the crisis had fully passed, and the exhausted healing house finally fell quiet, Rowan walked Ivy back toward her small living quarters, attached to the building, both of them moving slowly, with the particular tiredness that follows days of sustained crisis. "I have watched you these past 4 days," Rowan said quietly, as they paused outside her door. "I have watched you give everything you had, without hesitation, to people who have no claim on you, beyond simply needing help. I do not believe I have ever admired anyone the way I admire you." Ivy looked up at him, too tired for careful words, and found instead that the simple truth came easily. "I care for you too, Rowan, more than I have allowed myself to fully admit until now." The moment that followed was quiet and unhurried, matching everything about their relationship up to that point. A gentle acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily for months, finally given space to exist openly between them. Neither rushed to define exactly what came next, content instead to simply let the warmth of the moment settle naturally into the foundation of everything they had already built together. The formal marriage between Cale and Celine took place on a gray, overcast afternoon that many in the pack would later remark felt fitting for an event that carried so little of the genuine celebration that had marked Cale's first wedding years earlier. The ceremony itself proceeded according to tradition, witnessed by the council, the elders, and a subdued gathering of pack members, who attended more out of obligation than enthusiasm. Celine, now heavily pregnant and increasingly uncomfortable, wore an elaborate gown clearly designed to project confidence and celebration, though the effort could not fully mask the tension that had defined her relationship with the pack since her arrival. Vincent, her father, stood proudly at her side throughout the ceremony, his satisfaction evident in every carefully composed smile, though several of the elders noted privately that his satisfaction seemed to center more on the political and material benefits secured through the marriage than any genuine joy at his daughter's happiness. Cale performed his role throughout the ceremony with the practiced composure expected of a king, but those who knew him well, Edward, Daniel, Nora, and a handful of others who had served alongside him for years, recognized something hollow in his expression, a going-through-the-motions quality that stood in stark contrast to the genuine warmth he had shown, however briefly, during his first wedding to Ivy years earlier. The reception that followed carried a strained, performative quality throughout, guests offering polite congratulations, while conversations in quieter corners of the hall continued to circle the same unspoken questions that had followed the pack for months. Would this marriage bring the stability the kingdom needed, or simply formalize an arrangement that had already revealed itself as troubled from its very foundation? In the weeks following the marriage, the answer began to reveal itself with increasing clarity, and it was not the answer Cale had hoped for. Celine, now formally recognized as Luna, found that the title alone did not resolve the underlying distance between herself and the pack she was meant to lead. She continued struggling to earn the genuine respect that Ivy had built through years of consistent, selfless service, often overcompensating with displays of authority that only widened the gap between herself and the people she governed. 2 more experienced warriors requested transfer to allied territories within a month of the wedding, joining the others who had already left in the preceding months, and this time their reasons, though still couched in diplomatic language, made clearer reference to concerns about the pack's current leadership direction. "We are losing our most experienced people," Edward reported to Cale, during a particularly difficult council session, "and the younger warriors coming up through the ranks lack the guidance those departures represent. This pattern cannot continue indefinitely, without serious consequences for our overall strength and readiness." Cale absorbed this report with growing frustration, aware that the situation had moved well beyond what he could resolve through simple reassurance or minor policy adjustments. "What would you have me do, Edward? I have married Celine, as her family demanded. I have maintained the pack's usual training schedules and resource allocation. What more do these warriors expect?" "They expect," Edward said carefully, choosing his words with obvious caution, "the same quality of leadership this pack enjoyed under your father, and under your own early years as king, before certain choices began to erode the trust that had taken generations to build." The blunt honesty of the observation landed hard, and Cale found himself, not for the first time in recent months, without a satisfying response. He dismissed the council session shortly after, retreating to his study, with the same restless unease that had become an almost constant companion since Ivy's departure nearly 8 months earlier. It was during this same difficult period that one of the trackers Cale had sent out many months earlier, largely forgotten amid the more pressing crises the pack now faced, finally returned with news that immediately captured the king's full attention. "My king," the tracker said, kneeling briefly, before straightening to deliver his report, "I have located the former Luna. She resides in the Hartley territory, in a farming community at the northern edge of their lands, where she operates a healing house of her own." Cale's expression shifted rapidly through several emotions before settling into something carefully controlled. "You are certain?" "Entirely certain, my king. I observed her myself for several days before returning to report. She appears well established there, respected throughout the community, and by all accounts thriving in her new circumstances." The report struck Cale with a complicated mixture of relief, at finally having confirmed information after months of failed searches, and something considerably more uncomfortable, an awareness that Ivy's apparent thriving in her new life stood in stark, painful contrast to the increasingly troubled kingdom he now governed, alongside a wife whose position had brought him considerably more difficulty than the stability he had once believed she would provide. He dismissed the tracker with instructions to keep the information strictly confidential, then sat alone in his study for a long while, turning the news over carefully in his mind, aware that he now faced a decision considerably more complicated than simply confirming Ivy's location. The question that had haunted him with increasing intensity over the preceding months, whether he had made an irreversible mistake in the choices that led to her departure, now demanded an answer he could no longer avoid. Daniel found him there hours later, still deep in thought, the study lit only by a single low candle against the evening darkness outside. "You look troubled, my king. More so than usual," Daniel observed, settling into his familiar seat across the desk. "The trackers found her," Cale said simply. "Ivy. She has built a healing house of her own in the Hartley territory. She is, by all reports, thriving." Daniel absorbed this news carefully before responding. "That is significant information. What do you intend to do with it?" Cale was quiet for a long moment, staring at the candle flame as though it might offer an answer he could not find within himself. "I do not know yet, but I believe, for the first time in many months, that I finally need to find out." Outside the study window, the pack house had gone quiet for the night, the troubled kingdom sleeping uneasily beneath a leadership that had, in the span of less than a year, transformed from confident and stable into something far more uncertain. While 3 territories away, the woman that leadership had so carelessly dismissed continued building a life that grew stronger and more genuine with every passing week, entirely unaware that the shadow of her past was, at that very moment, beginning to stir once again. In the days that followed the tracker's report, Cale found himself unable to focus on even the most routine matters of governance, his mind repeatedly drawn back to the image of Ivy building an entire healing house from nothing, earning the respect and gratitude of an entire farming community through nothing but her own effort and skill. He compared this, almost against his will, to Celine's continued struggle to earn even basic goodwill from a pack she now formally led, and the comparison did not favor the choice he had made. Celine, for her part, had grown increasingly withdrawn in the weeks following her marriage, sensing correctly that something had shifted in Cale's demeanor, without understanding exactly what had caused it. She attributed his distraction to the ongoing difficulties with pack morale and the ongoing departures of experienced warriors, unaware that a tracker's report had reopened questions Cale had spent months trying to bury beneath practical justifications and forced commitment. "You are somewhere else lately," Celine observed one evening, watching him from across their shared chambers as he stared unseeing at reports he had not actually read in several minutes. "The pack requires considerable attention right now," Cale replied, the excuse feeling thinner each time he offered it. "That has been your answer for months," Celine said, an edge of genuine hurt creeping into her voice, despite her usual composure. "I am carrying your child, Cale. I have married you, given up my own standing, endured a pack that still speaks her name more often than mine. I would like, just once, for you to be fully present with me, rather than perpetually distracted by whatever weighs on your mind." Cale looked up at her then, genuinely considering her words, and felt a complicated wave of guilt wash through him, not because he did not care for Celine at all, but because he recognized, with uncomfortable clarity, that his feelings for her had never carried the same depth as what he had once shared with Ivy, even during the difficult final year of that first marriage. He had chosen excitement over substance, novelty over genuine partnership, and the consequences of that choice were now unfolding around him in ways he could no longer ignore or explain away. "I am sorry," he said quietly, and meant it, though the apology addressed only part of what actually troubled him. "I will try to do better." Celine studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing that his apology, however sincere, did not fully address whatever truly occupied his thoughts. But she said nothing further, retreating instead into the careful, guarded distance that had increasingly come to define their marriage in the weeks since the wedding. Meanwhile, word of the tracker's successful mission had not remained as confidential as Cale had instructed, filtering slowly through the pack's tightly connected network of servants and advisors, until even Nora and Edward had heard whispers that the former Luna's location had finally been confirmed. Neither spoke of it directly to Cale, respecting the sensitivity of the matter, but both found themselves watching him more closely in the days that followed, aware that whatever decision he ultimately made regarding this information would likely determine the future direction of the entire kingdom. "Do you believe he will go to her?" Edward asked Nora quietly one evening, as they observed the king's increasingly distracted behavior during a routine council session. Nora considered the question with the careful patience of someone who had watched many difficult situations unfold over a long lifetime. "I believe," she said slowly, "that a man who has spent 8 months, unable to fully commit himself to the wife he chose in haste, is a man who has already answered that question for himself, whether he has admitted it aloud yet or not." Cale made his decision 3 weeks after the tracker's report, on a morning when Celine had left early to visit her family's territory for a brief stay, meant to ease the tension that had grown between them, tension that both of them privately understood, extended far beyond simple distraction with pack matters. He informed Edward of his intention to travel personally to the Hartley territory, offering the same explanation he had given himself for months, that pack stability required a properly recognized Luna, and that this journey represented a necessary step toward resolving that ongoing instability. Edward, who had served the Ashrin family long enough to recognize when a stated reason concealed a deeper, more personal motivation, said nothing to challenge the explanation, simply nodding and arranging for a small, discreet escort to accompany the king on his journey. "Discreet," Cale emphasized. "I do not wish this trip discussed beyond what is absolutely necessary." "Understood, my king," Edward replied, though something in his expression suggested he understood considerably more than Cale had explicitly stated. The journey to the Hartley territory took 4 days, longer than Cale remembered such distances typically requiring, though he suspected his own growing anxiety about the eventual destination made the travel feel slower than it actually was. He rehearsed various versions of what he might say to Ivy throughout the journey, discarding each one as either too formal, too presumptuous, or too transparently self-serving, aware that he had spent months preparing for this moment, without ever settling on an approach that felt genuinely honest, rather than strategically calculated. They arrived at the border of the Hartley territory on the afternoon of the fourth day, and Cale left most of his escort at a modest inn near the main settlement, continuing north toward the outpost with only a single guard, wanting to approach Ivy without the intimidating presence of a full royal entourage that might make the encounter feel more like a political event than the personal conversation he actually intended. The northern outpost, when he finally arrived at its edge in the late afternoon light, looked nothing like what he had expected. He had imagined, based on the tracker's brief report, a modest operation, perhaps a small room, where Ivy treated occasional patients between other responsibilities. Instead, he found a properly established healing house, clearly well-maintained and actively busy, with several farmers waiting patiently outside for treatment, and the sound of confident, purposeful activity coming from within. He stood at the edge of the property for a long moment, uncertain how to proceed, before a young woman he did not recognize, Hannah, emerged from the building carrying a basket of freshly gathered herbs, and noticed him standing there. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her tone polite but curious, clearly noting the fine quality of his travel clothes, despite his attempt at a more modest appearance. "I am here to see Ivy," Cale said, his voice steadier than he felt. "She is with a patient at the moment," Hannah replied. "You are welcome to wait, if your business is not urgent." Cale nodded, and settled onto a bench near the entrance, watching the steady rhythm of activity around the healing house, with a growing, uncomfortable awareness of exactly how thoroughly Ivy had built a life here that required nothing from him at all. Farmers greeted each other warmly while waiting. Children ran through the nearby field with the easy carelessness of a community that felt genuinely safe, and the entire scene carried a warmth and stability that stood in stark contrast to the tense, uncertain atmosphere that had settled over his own kingdom in the months since her departure. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Ivy finally emerged from the healing house, wiping her hands on a cloth as she said something encouraging to the departing patient behind her, an older man who thanked her repeatedly as he made his way back toward the farming community. She turned toward the bench where Cale sat, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, the shock of the encounter settling over both of them in a heavy, charged silence. "Cale," Ivy said finally, her voice carefully controlled, giving away none of the complicated emotions the sight of him had stirred within her. "Ivy." He stood slowly, suddenly uncertain of every rehearsed word he had prepared during the long journey north. "You look well." "I am well," she replied simply, no warmth in her tone, but no bitterness either. Simply a steady, factual statement from a woman who had clearly moved well beyond needing his approval for anything. "May we speak somewhere private?" he asked. Ivy considered the request for a long moment before nodding, gesturing toward a quiet path that led away from the healing house, toward the edge of the surrounding field, away from the ears of waiting patients and curious neighbors. They walked together in silence for several minutes, the distance between them carrying a weight neither seemed quite ready to address directly. "Why are you here, Cale?" Ivy finally asked, once they had reached a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree at the field's edge. He took a long breath before answering, aware that whatever he said next would likely determine the entire outcome of this journey. "I came because I needed to see for myself that you were safe, that you had found a good life after everything that happened. You could have sent a tracker to confirm that, and in fact you did, months ago. You did not need to come yourself for that purpose." The direct observation, delivered without cruelty but with unmistakable clarity, forced Cale to confront the gap between his stated reason and his actual motivation, more honestly than he had allowed himself to during the entire 4-day journey. "You are right. I did not come simply to confirm your safety. I came because I have spent the past 8 months slowly realizing what I lost the night I announced Celine's pregnancy in front of the entire pack, and I could not continue pretending that realization did not matter." Ivy studied him carefully, her expression giving away little, though something in her steady gaze suggested she was genuinely listening, rather than simply waiting for him to finish so she could dismiss him. "And what exactly do you believe you lost?" "A partner who gave everything to this pack without ever demanding recognition for it," Cale said, the words coming more easily, now that he had committed to honesty, rather than careful diplomatic phrasing. "A wife who understood what this kingdom actually needed, better than I often did myself." I lost you, Ivy, and I have watched everything I built in your absence slowly fall apart in ways I did not fully anticipate when I made the choices that drove you away. You are married to Celine now, Ivy observed, her tone still carefully neutral. You have a child on the way. Whatever regret you feel does not undo those realities. I am aware of that, Cale said. I am not here to ask you to undo anything, or to pretend that my marriage to Celine did not happen. I am here because I needed you to know the truth, that dismissing you so easily was the greatest mistake of my life, and that I have spent every day since regretting it more deeply than I believed possible. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with months of accumulated regret, and Ivy found herself studying this man she had once loved, or believed she loved, with something closer to distant curiosity than any lingering emotional attachment. She had spent 8 months building a life entirely free of the constant hope and disappointment that had defined her marriage to him, and standing here now, hearing his belated regret, she felt surprisingly little beyond a quiet, settled clarity about exactly how far she had traveled, beyond needing anything from him at all. I appreciate your honesty, Cale, she said finally, but I do not know what you expect from me in response. I have built an entire life here, one that has nothing to do with you, and I have no intention of unraveling it because you have belatedly discovered what you lost. I am not asking you to return with me, Cale said quickly, though the words carried less conviction than he perhaps intended. I simply needed you to know the truth. Ivy nodded slowly, accepting this, though something in his expression told her the conversation had not yet reached its natural conclusion, and she found herself bracing, quietly, for whatever came next. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, and both turned to see Rowan making his way along the path toward them, having arrived at the healing house shortly after Cale's arrival, and been informed by Hannah of the unexpected visitor waiting to speak with Ivy privately. Something in Hannah's description of the well-dressed stranger had immediately concerned him, and he had come to check on Ivy without hesitation. Is everything all right? Rowan asked, his eyes moving between Ivy and the unfamiliar man beside her, though his tone remained carefully measured, despite the obvious tension he sensed in the scene before him. Everything is fine, Ivy said, though the slight edge in her voice suggested the conversation had been anything but comfortable. Rowan, this is Cale Ashrin. Cale, this is Rowan Ellison. Recognition flickered across Rowan's expression at the name, understanding immediately who this man was and what his unexpected arrival likely meant. He stepped closer to Ivy's side, not aggressively, but with the quiet, protective steadiness that had become such a familiar part of his presence over the preceding months. I have heard your name mentioned before, Rowan said evenly, addressing Cale directly. Though I confess, I did not expect to meet you in person, and certainly not here. Cale studied the other man carefully, noting the easy familiarity between him and Ivy, the protective way he had positioned himself, and felt a fresh wave of understanding settle over him regarding exactly how thoroughly his own opportunity with Ivy had already passed. I came to speak with Ivy about matters from our shared past. I did not intend to intrude on whatever life she has built here since. And yet here you are, Rowan observed, his tone still carefully polite, but carrying an unmistakable firmness beneath the surface courtesy. Intruding, regardless of your intentions. Rowan, Ivy said gently, placing a calming hand on his arm. It is all right. Cale was simply leaving. The pointed statement, delivered calmly but with unmistakable finality, made clear exactly where matters stood, and Cale, recognizing the closed door in front of him for exactly what it was, found himself with nothing further to say that would change the outcome of this journey. I understand, Cale said quietly, and for the first time since his arrival, Ivy saw something genuinely humbled in his expression, an acceptance of a reality he had perhaps hoped, against reason, might unfold differently. I wish you well, Ivy. Truly. Whatever life you have built here, you deserve it, and more. Thank you, Ivy said simply, her tone free of anger, but equally free of any lingering warmth that might have once softened such a farewell. I wish you well also, Cale. I hope you find whatever peace you are searching for, though I do not believe you will find it by looking backward. Cale nodded slowly, then turned, and made his way back down the path toward the waiting road, his single guard falling into step behind him, leaving Ivy and Rowan standing together, beneath the oak tree, in the fading afternoon light. "Are you truly all right?" Rowan asked once Cale had disappeared from view, studying her face carefully for any sign of the emotional turmoil such an encounter might reasonably have stirred. Ivy considered the question honestly, taking a moment to check in with her own feelings before answering. "I am." It was strange, seeing him again, hearing him admit regrets I once desperately wanted to hear from him. But standing here now, I feel nothing but relief that I made the choice to leave when I did, and gratitude for everything I have built since. Rowan studied her for a long moment, then reached out to gently take her hand, his expression carrying a warmth that had grown steadily more open between them over recent weeks. "I am glad, and for what it is worth, I do not believe he deserved the chance he came here hoping to ask for." "No," Ivy agreed, squeezing his hand gently. "He did not. But I am glad he came, in a strange way. It confirmed something I already suspected, but had not fully tested until today." "What is that?" "That I have truly moved on," Ivy said, looking up at the darkening sky above them, "completely and without reservation. Whatever I once felt for him belongs entirely to the past now, and I am ready, fully, for whatever comes next." As they walked back toward the healing house together, hand in hand, the last light of the afternoon fading into the soft colors of evening, neither of them yet knew how quickly the consequences of Cale's journey would begin unfolding back in the kingdom he had left behind, consequences that would soon make his brief, humbling visit to the northern outpost seem like only the beginning of a much larger reckoning still to come. While Cale made his quiet, humbling journey back from the Hartley territory, events within his own kingdom had begun unfolding in ways that would soon overshadow even the personal reckoning he carried with him on the long road home. Celine, during her extended visit to her family's territory, had grown increasingly candid in private conversations with her father and sister, conversations that a household servant, loyal ultimately to the Ashrin pack rather than to Celine's family, overheard and later reported back to Edward upon Celine's return. The details, once they finally reached Edward and subsequently the pack's senior council, painted a considerably more troubling picture than anyone had previously suspected. Celine, it emerged, had specifically targeted Cale months before the coronation feast, encouraged by her family to secure a connection with the Ashrin kingdom through whatever means necessary. Given the political and economic advantages such a connection would provide her family's modest territory. The timing of her pregnancy, rather than being the natural consequence of a genuine romantic relationship, had been calculated with unsettling precision, discussed openly among her family members as a strategic necessity to secure her position before Cale's attention could wander elsewhere, or before Ivy's steady presence could reassert its hold over his affections. More troubling still, the servant reported overhearing a conversation suggesting uncertainty within Celine's own family regarding the child's actual parentage, uncertainty that Celine herself had dismissed with cold practicality rather than genuine concern, reportedly stating that the matter mattered considerably less than ensuring the child was recognized as Cale's regardless of biological reality, given how much the family's fortunes now depended on that recognition. Edward brought this information to Nora first, both of them recognizing immediately the gravity of what they had learned, and the careful judgment required in deciding how to proceed. "This cannot remain buried," Nora said firmly, once Edward had finished relaying the full account. "If true, this represents a betrayal that goes beyond simple personal matters. It touches the very succession of this kingdom." "The king is still traveling," Edward said. "He will return within a day or two. I believe this matter must be brought to him directly, and privately, before any wider disclosure occurs, to allow him the chance to determine how best to proceed." Nora agreed, and the two of them spent the following days quietly verifying what details they could through careful, discreet inquiries among trusted members of the household staff, uncovering additional corroborating details that only deepened their concern regarding the true nature of Celine's relationship with Cale and the circumstances surrounding her pregnancy. Cale returned to the kingdom on a cold, overcast morning, his own mind still occupied with the humbling encounter at the Hartley outpost, unprepared for the considerably more serious matter waiting for him upon his arrival. Edward requested a private audience immediately, and something in the guard's grave expression told Cale this conversation would carry weight far beyond routine pack business. "What has happened?" Cale asked, settling into his study, as Edward closed the door carefully behind them. Edward relayed the full account carefully, methodically, sparing no detail, despite the discomfort evident in his own expression, as he delivered news he knew would land as a devastating blow. Cale listened in growing, horrified silence, the pieces of Celine's calculated maneuvering, the family's strategic ambitions, the deeply troubling uncertainty regarding the child's true parentage, settling over him with a weight that made the regret he had carried home from the Hartley territory seem almost minor by comparison. "You are certain of this account," Cale said finally, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil evident beneath the surface. "As certain as careful verification allows, my king. Multiple sources within the household corroborate the core details, though the matter of the child's parentage remains, admittedly, the most difficult element to confirm, without direct confrontation." Cale sat in silence for a long moment, processing the full weight of what he had just learned. He had married Celine believing, however imperfectly, that their relationship carried genuine substance beneath its more superficial excitement. Learning that the entire arrangement had been calculated from its earliest days, and that even the pregnancy at its center might not carry the biological connection he had publicly announced with such confidence at his own coronation feast, forced him to confront the full scope of exactly how thoroughly his judgment had failed him over the preceding year. "I need to speak with her directly," Cale said finally. The confrontation, when it came later that same day, unfolded with a rawness that neither Cale nor Celine had previously allowed to surface between them. Cale laid out what Edward had reported, watching Celine's expression carefully as he spoke, and found his answer in the way her carefully composed confidence gradually crumbled beneath the weight of accusations she could not convincingly deny. "You do not understand the pressure my family placed on me," Celine said finally, her voice breaking with genuine emotion for perhaps the first time since Cale had known her. "They saw an opportunity, and I was young enough, ambitious enough, to believe that opportunity mattered more than honesty." "And the child?" Cale asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the turmoil evident beneath the surface. "Is the child even mine, Celine?" The long, painful silence that followed answered the question more clearly than any words could have, and Cale felt something inside him finally, completely settle into clarity regarding exactly how thoroughly he had been deceived, and exactly how much of his own foolish pride and wounded ego had made that deception possible in the first place. "I do not know for certain," Celine finally admitted, tears now falling freely. "There is a possibility the child belongs to someone from my own territory, someone I was involved with before my family redirected my attention towards securing a connection with you. I did not want to believe it either, but I cannot say with honest certainty that the child is yours." The admission, delivered at last after months of careful deception, brought the entire elaborate structure Cale had built his recent life upon crashing down completely. He sat in stunned silence for a long while, absorbing the full weight of what her confession meant, not just for his own personal circumstances, but for the entire kingdom that had suffered through months of instability, built upon a foundation of calculated lies. Word of the confrontation, despite every effort to keep the matter contained, inevitably began spreading through the pack within days, as such significant news always eventually did, regardless of how carefully those involved attempted to manage its disclosure. The council convened an emergency session, and this time, unlike the strained, uncertain gatherings of recent months, the discussion carried a clarity born of finally understanding the true nature of the crisis the kingdom had been navigating. "The marriage cannot stand," Nora stated firmly during the session, her voice carrying the full authority of her decades of service to the pack. Whatever compassion we might extend to Lady Celine, given the pressure her family placed upon her, a marriage, built upon calculated deception, regarding something as fundamental as the succession, cannot be permitted to continue, for the sake of this kingdom's stability and integrity. The council agreed unanimously, and within the week, formal proceedings began to dissolve the marriage, a process considerably more straightforward than it might have otherwise been, given the clear evidence of deception at its foundation. Celine's family, recognizing the complete collapse of their carefully constructed ambitions, quietly withdrew their claims and departed the kingdom, taking Celine with them back to her home territory, her position and reputation both thoroughly diminished by the public unraveling of what had once seemed a triumphant securing of royal favor. Cale, left to face the full consequences of his own choices, spent the following weeks in a state of careful, humbled reflection, finally understanding, with complete clarity, exactly how thoroughly his pursuit of excitement and validation over genuine partnership had cost him not only his marriage to Ivy, but very nearly the stability of the entire kingdom he had been raised to protect and lead. In the days following the dissolution of the marriage, Daniel found himself once again summoned to Cale's study, though this time the king's demeanor carried a different quality than the uncertain, defensive posture he had maintained during their previous difficult conversations. "I owe you an apology," Cale said, once Daniel had settled into his usual seat. "You warned me months ago that I did not fully understand what I had lost. I dismissed your observation, as though it were simply the sympathetic loyalty of an advisor who admired Ivy's work. I understand now that you were offering me considerably more honest counsel than I was willing to accept at the time." "You do not owe me an apology, my king," Daniel replied. "You owe yourself patience as you work through the consequences of these past months. Self-recrimination will not undo what has happened, any more than continued pride would have prevented it." "What would you have me do now?" Cale asked, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the question carried genuine, unguarded uncertainty, rather than the practiced authority Cale had once wielded so effortlessly. Daniel considered the question carefully before responding. "I would have you focus first on rebuilding the trust this pack has lost in your judgment, through consistent, honest leadership over time, rather than any single grand gesture. Trust rebuilds slowly, my king, through accumulated small actions, rather than dramatic declarations." "And beyond that?" "Beyond that," Daniel said gently, "I would have you consider carefully what you actually want your future to look like, separate from pride, separate from public image, separate from the fear of appearing weak or indecisive. You spent the past year making choices driven by those pressures, and I believe this pack, and you yourself, would benefit considerably from decisions grounded instead in genuine reflection about what actually matters to you." Cale absorbed this counsel quietly, recognizing in it the same honest clarity Daniel had offered him throughout the difficult months since Ivy's departure, clarity he had too often dismissed in favor of more comfortable, self-serving explanations. "I do not know if I can ever fully earn back what I lost," he admitted quietly. "Not just Ivy, though I understand now that door has closed permanently, and rightfully so, but the trust of this entire pack. Perhaps not entirely," Daniel said honestly, "but partial repair, built through genuine sustained effort, is still worth pursuing, my king, both for the sake of this kingdom, and for your own sake as its leader." The council, meanwhile, faced the practical challenge of reassuring both the pack and its allied territories that the kingdom's leadership, despite the very public unraveling of the past year's events, remained stable and capable of sound judgment moving forward. Edward and Nora worked closely with Cale over the following weeks, helping him rebuild the systems of consultation and careful decision-making that had characterized the kingdom's stronger years, before pride and impulsive choices had led it toward the crisis it had only narrowly avoided. Slowly, incrementally, the pack's mood began to shift, not toward the easy confidence of earlier years, but toward a cautious, watchful hope that their king had genuinely learned from the painful lessons of the preceding year, and that the kingdom's future, while forever marked by the difficult events of that turbulent year, might yet find its way back toward the stability and genuine strength it had once taken for granted. A full year passed after Ivy Calloway walked out of the Ashrin Great Hall with nothing but a small bag and a quiet, unshakable smile, and in that year, two lives that had once been bound tightly together by a marriage of convenience had grown into shapes neither could have predicted on that fateful coronation night. In the Hartley territory, the northern outpost had grown into one of the most respected healing houses in the entire region, its reputation now extending well beyond the borders of the farming community it had originally been built to serve. Ivy had taken on 2 additional apprentices beyond Hannah, both promising young healers eager to learn under her careful guidance, and the outpost now regularly received visitors from neighboring territories seeking treatment for conditions their own local healers had struggled to resolve. Her relationship with Rowan had deepened steadily throughout that year, growing from careful courtship into a partnership built on the kind of mutual respect and genuine affection that had never existed in her first marriage. He had, several months after Cale's brief humbling visit to the outpost, formally asked her to consider a future together, not through grand public declaration in front of a crowded hall, but through a quiet, sincere conversation beneath the same oak tree where Cale had once confessed his belated regrets. "I do not wish to rush you," Rowan had said that evening, "given everything you experienced in your first marriage, but I have never been more certain of anything than I am of wanting to build a life with you, whenever and however you feel ready for that step." Ivy had said yes, not with the desperate hope she had once carried into her marriage to Cale, believing that duty might eventually grow into love, but with the settled, confident certainty of a woman who had built an entire life on her own terms, and now chose, freely and completely, to share that life with someone who had earned her trust through months of consistent, genuine care, rather than empty promises. Their wedding, held the following spring in the very field beside the healing house where their relationship had first deepened during the difficult days of the winter illness outbreak, carried none of the elaborate political ceremony that had marked Ivy's first marriage. Instead, the entire farming community gathered to celebrate, families she had healed over the preceding year, standing alongside apprentices she had trained, and neighbors who had become genuine friends, all of them witnessing a union built on foundations considerably more solid than anything a royal coronation could provide. Old Edward, the farmer whose granddaughter had survived the winter illness outbreak thanks to Ivy's tireless care, stood near the front of the small gathering, his weathered face carrying an expression of genuine joy as he watched the ceremony unfold. "This is how a marriage should begin," he remarked quietly to Claire, who had traveled from the main Hartley settlement to witness the wedding of the healer she had trained and grown to consider almost a daughter, built on years of proven character, rather than a single moment of duty or convenience. Claire nodded in agreement, her own eyes damp with pride as she watched Ivy, radiant and genuinely happy, exchange vows with a man who had spent an entire year proving, through patient, consistent action, exactly the kind of partner he intended to be. Far to the east, in the Ashrin Kingdom, Cale's own journey through that same year had followed a considerably more difficult path, though one that had, through genuine effort and Daniel's honest counsel, gradually led toward meaningful growth, rather than continued stagnation. The dissolution of his marriage to Celine had initially left the kingdom in a fragile, uncertain state, but Cale's subsequent commitment to rebuilding trust through consistent, careful leadership had slowly begun repairing the damage of the preceding difficult months. He had not remarried in the year since Celine's departure, choosing instead to focus his full attention on restoring the kingdom's stability and, in quieter moments, on genuinely reflecting on the choices that had led him so far astray from the steady, principled leadership his father had once modeled for him. He visited the healing house regularly during this period, not out of any lingering romantic attachment to its former leader, but out of a genuine desire to understand and honor the kind of selfless, dedicated service Ivy had once provided, work he now recognized he had taken entirely for granted during their marriage. Grace, who had grown considerably into her own leadership role over the healing house during that difficult year, found herself pleasantly surprised by the king's evolving attitude toward her work and her staff, a marked contrast to the distracted indifference he had shown during the earlier months of Ivy's absence. "You have changed, my king," Grace observed one afternoon, as Cale reviewed updated resource allocations for the healing house's continued operation, allocations considerably more generous than anything the healing house had received in previous years. "I hope so," Cale replied honestly. "I spent a long time believing that leadership meant commanding respect through authority alone. I understand now that genuine respect must be earned, through consistent care for the people who depend on you, rather than simply assumed as an entitlement of position." The observation, delivered with genuine humility rather than performative self-criticism, reflected a transformation that had taken the better part of a year to fully develop, built through countless small decisions and honest conversations with advisors like Daniel and Edward, who had remained patiently committed to helping their king find his way back toward the kind of leader his kingdom genuinely needed. News of Ivy's wedding eventually reached the Ashrin Kingdom through the same trade networks that had once carried word of her original departure, and when Cale learned of it, he found himself experiencing something considerably different from the sharp regret that had once accompanied any thought of her. Instead, he felt something closer to genuine gladness, a recognition that the woman he had once carelessly dismissed had found exactly the kind of partnership and happiness she had always deserved, even if that happiness had ultimately been built with someone other than himself. "She deserves every bit of joy this news suggests she has found," Cale told Daniel, upon sharing the news during one of their now regular private conversations. I spent a long time believing my regret over losing her meant I still loved her in some way that demanded resolution. I understand now that what I actually felt was regret over my own failures, not genuine longing for a relationship that had already run its natural course by the time I made the choices that ended it. That is a healthier understanding than the one you carried a year ago, Daniel observed. It took considerable time and difficulty to arrive at it, Cale admitted. But yes, I believe it is. Back in the Hartley territory, as the wedding celebration continued late into the evening, Ivy found a quiet moment to step away from the joyful gathering, walking alone to the edge of the field, where she had once stood on the day the healing house first opened, looking out over the same distant hills that had marked the horizon of her new life a full year earlier. Rowan found her there a few minutes later, joining her quietly, the way he always did, without pressing her to explain her need for a moment of solitude amid their own wedding celebration. "Reflecting on the past year?" he asked gently. "On the past several years, actually," Ivy admitted, leaning into his steady presence beside her. "I spent so long believing that a smile, a calm exterior, a willingness to endure whatever came my way, was the same thing as strength. It took walking away from everything I thought I was supposed to want, to understand that real strength meant choosing myself, even when that choice terrified me." "And now?" Rowan asked. Ivy turned to look at him, her husband now, standing beside her not out of duty or convenient arrangement, but out of genuine, freely chosen commitment, built over a year of consistent, honest partnership. "Now I understand that walking away that night was not the end of anything worth having. It was the beginning of everything that actually matters." Behind them, the celebration continued, warm and genuine, filled with the sounds of a community that had watched Ivy Calloway transform from a quietly wounded former Luna into one of the most respected and beloved healers in the entire region. A transformation built not on anyone else's recognition or approval, but on her own steady, patient commitment to building a life worthy of the strength she had always carried within her, even during the years when that strength had gone unnoticed and unappreciated by the very people who should have valued it most. The night sky above the northern outpost stretched clear and full of stars, the same kind of sky that had watched over her that first difficult night 3 territories away, when she had sat on a bench outside a different healing house and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to simply breathe and imagine a future entirely her own. That future had arrived, fuller and more genuine than she could have imagined on that uncertain night, and as she stood now beside a husband who had earned every bit of the love she offered him freely, Ivy Calloway understood completely that the smile she had worn walking out of that coronation feast had not been a mask concealing heartbreak, but the first honest expression of a woman finally choosing, without hesitation or apology, the life she actually deserved.